The trouble is the mechanists, the developing scientists and mathematicians of the age of reason, went in for concrete objectivity, which of course opposes Plato's idea of our perceptions being approximations. And this was the start of a huge cultural battle which Charles Fort inherited. And this conflict between Platonic approximations and the concrete objective approach of science is a thing which still bedevils us. You can hear it in the UFO debates, you can hear it in the debates about the paranormal, about occultism, and about the theory of anomalies. It's the same scientific objectivity versus Platonic approximations. Fort took up the baton and wrote a book in which he discussed these things. He was rejecting the mechanism of the 19th century. He was born a young man. Let's not talk about when people were born, but when they were in their formative youth. It's more important. In pre-1914 America. Now, pre-1914 America was a scene of mechanistic triumph. Henry Ford and the great inventors, the great mechanistic inventors and creators, were the gods of the pre-1914 American universe. And they were commercial gods too. And it was all about money. It was all about the accretion of wealth. It was the formation of the modern American capitalist consciousness. Fort was against this, which of course is not a very good position to be in if your another god is facing Henry Ford. And he wrote a book called The Book of the Damned, in which he saw that the industrial mechanistic world of Henry Ford and company was opposed by closer observation of the world. What was this closer observation of the world? He spent his time, did Fort, in American libraries. He was a very, very poor man, but he couldn't knock in a nail. And as such, he lived in terrible poverty all his life, spending his time in libraries. And what was he in libraries for? He was searching through every single magazine and newspaper and article in the world. What for? He was looking for hairline cracks in perception. This is the Fortean theory, hairline cracks in perception, to find the anomaly or contradiction or paradox within the scheme of things which gave lie to the system as an objective, concrete manifestation. Yeah. What were these hairline cracks in reality? What were these anomalies and paradoxes that he found that defied the idea that outer reality was a supine thing, a dead thing, that you examined of will? He found examples of the most extraordinary things. Rains of frogs, for example. Yeah. Periwinkles strewn over Sussex in an hour. Here's the beginning of the Fortean theory, the Royal Road to the Fortean theory. Take the example of a newspaper reporting that countless millions of periwinkles, for God's sake, were found strewn over a county in Essex overnight. The explanation was, says Fort, and he's a great humorist, that a fishmonger did it. This is the theory of explanations, that we encounter such immensities, such absurd fields of experience, such as countless millions of periwinkles, and we explain it by saying a fishmonger did it. Fort goes on to say that it must have been a very charitable fishmonger indeed, because the periwinkles were fresh and quite expensive food, and therefore the explanation for the presence of the periwinkles was more absurd than saying a Martian brought them there or they came from a spaceship. So this is the 14 theories of explanations, that often our explanations have nothing to do with any kind of truth, but are mechanisms by means of which we comfort ourselves. Yeah. We allow ourselves to get some sleep at night. And so the explanation, in particularly the scientific explanation, he saw as more a wonder management vehicle or technique in order to allow us to give some order to creation. The hairline cracks, the contradictions, we brushed aside. And this is the classic Fortean position, that our explanations are facades, if you like. The conclusion is that our imagination, our consciousness is structured by these facades which we erect called explanations. And this at the time, this kind of thinking at the time in the pre-1914 world in America was of course quite revolutionary. No one was thinking like this at all. He was the most original philosopher. Moreover, he wasn't an academic philosopher. Who reads academic philosophers? Their books are almost unreadable. But you can read Ford as you can read Rabelais. It's a great comic, if you like, philosophy, and as such, it's user-friendly. You can read it, and you can get these very, very deep ideas about consciousness as being a system of stage constructs that we live with. We half know that we're living with falsehoods, but we call them different kinds of reality. As I say, this is the postmodern position in outline, yeah, and it's nothing to do with incomprehensible Frenchmen. It's unreadable books, which postmodernism has developed a rather bad reputation in the modern world. But this Ford was stating basically the postmodern position, that our experience is mainly consists of advertising constructs of various kinds of strength, and his idea that we scale down experience. In other words, the simple universe of fact versus fiction is replaced by a much more sophisticated structure. I think I'll have a little break there.
That's great.
All right. All right.
Yeah, my camera's rolling.
Yes. Okay.
Could we jump to Colin Bennett's way of thinking?
Yeah. Well, I discovered Charles Ford at the university over 30 years ago, and when you're at university, of course, you're always looking for philosophers of different kinds, because you're in a thinking community, and the philosophers are bought and sold every 5 minutes. And I wasn't happy with Bertrand Russell or Whitehead. I wasn't happy with any kind of philosopher. I wanted a philosopher, if you like, to fit with the ideas of the late 60s that I was absorbing. You know, everything you can think of, from Timothy Leary to Wilhelm Reich, you know, from Allen Ginsberg to Jerry Rubin. Yeah, and there was no philosopher that fitted this world. You could say that there were one or two approximated to it, but the one I found was Charles Ford. Long dead, of course. He died in the early 1930s. But the kind of things that the 60s writers were talking and writing about didn't have a great synthesizing mind to bring them together. Individually, they were absolutely wonderful, but there was no great... Marshall McLuhan, I suppose, was the one, and that one looked to, because everybody started talking about media. Now, we're talking about 30 years ago now. Media was a fascinating thing. It was beginning to flex its muscles. It flexed its muscles in Vietnam, for the first time. Before Vietnam, colour television was a thing that flickered in the corner of the room. It was McLuhan who introduced us. Don't bother about that. Don't bother about mathematics. Don't bother about physics. Watch that flickering screen. That's the key leader. And people were turning from formal historical approaches to experience in the classical way when I was at university. I was at Oxford, to this screen, which of course a lot of people, the stiff kind of personality, didn't like at all. They thought that it was a plaything, that well, what is this? It was a ball, it was a toy. And McLuhan introduced us all, through his books, to the theory that this was going to control our entire reality. That this output of images was going to be the #1 governor of the coming universe, which of course 30 years later, looking back, it did indeed. Yeah, because almost everything is, if you like, to use a negative phrase, contaminated by media, presentation and image, and science even more so. The recent the recent CHOP, I'll start again, the recent Mars Explorer episode was entertainment. So was the moonshot 30 years ago. The moonshot 30 years ago, its scientific yield, its technological yield was comparatively zero to being a show. And so the same with the recent adventures of the Mars rover. First-class entertainment. Its scientific yield, there was some scientific yield at least, is zero. In other words, its analog rationalizations are zero before the power of its presentation. Yeah. So you're having images take over rational analog information as it was. Now, this in the 30 years back, this was a new thing to us. I saw it, so did several other people. That this was going, but the formal, stiff type said, no, it's a toy, it's a bauble, it's not going to be functional, it's not going to take over society. It is pop, it's trash. That's what they identified popular culture with trash for the peasants. Yeah, and that's what often they said. Yeah, and it was going to be posh, stiff, but clever guys who were still going to be the rulers of the universe. And I'm afraid 30 years later, they're down there as engines of reality, if you like. It's Michael Jackson, excuse me. Well, this 30 years ago, this was a universe described, prophesied by people like Marshall McLuhan. But Marshall McLuhan wasn't, although a genius and a great 20th century thinker, wasn't as big a philosopher as one would have liked. And so I personally, and with quite a few other people, we were reading literature, of course, and so books were our life, night and day, and we discovered Charles Fort in some tatty old volumes. He wasn't a popular writer in his day. He was published with more than, so he was lucky, but more than Kafka, who poor Kafka doesn't seem right, whose work didn't see the light of day at all. And we found these scuffed books of Charles Fort. It was a collected volume, and we immediately read this, and we realised that we had a almost totally unrecognised writer who, though long dead, had synthesised a lot of the much later developments. Writers with brains can do this. They live in several different universes at once. Time matters very little to them. Shakespeare is still 100% relative to the 20th century. And Fort was somehow the philosopher that, the thinker, if you like, who synthesized a lot of the late 60s experience to us and brought the 20th century, the late 20th century, into focus with the depth that we required. He was also, of course, deliciously anarchist. He was deliciously anti-authoritarian. But that's why he wasn't a popular figure, particularly amongst scientists. Now, if you're what we admired was the heroic stance of Charles Fort. If you decide to take on the entire world, and you're chopping up chairs for firewood at the same time as trying to feed your wife and your parrot, which is only possession, then this was a 20th century hero. This was straight out of Dostoevsky and whatever. He wasn't an establishment figure at all. And so we delighted in this, that such thoughts and such books should come out of such an impoverished figure who was straight out of Dostoevsky. And as such, against American glamour, against American capitalism, against American sheen and gloss, the whole thing which is being sold through the film industry at this time. Yeah. And he stood out. And of course, to take on science itself, when scientists usually are extremely clever people. And they were building at this time, of course, a monstrous facade as we are the governors of reality. We will produce your dreams for you. We will discover the secrets of the universe for you, and it's done through objective experimentation. It's okay so long as you don't hear the animals screaming. And it's okay so long as you don't think of what we're ignoring. And we have the same problem today with regard to the UFO, the flying saucer. We have the same debate. It was initiated by Charles Fort, who was the first person before 1914 to observe UFOs and to look at the explanations to them which were absurd. And the same explanations are being trotted out by skeptics today. So he initiated this debate between the anomaly and the contradiction in experience and reality and so-called scientific fact, which tends to dismiss all these odd things. Now, if you dismiss the odd and peculiar incidents that occur in experience, you miss out, and this is another thing that Charles Fort pointed out, you miss out on the rainforest, what I call it the rainforest. Yeah. Scientists, for example, and skeptics pounce on eccentrics. They pounce on the odd. They pounce on the people who are losers. And Charles Fort, sales-wise, was a loser. And they pick on these people, and they tend to sweep them aside, and rather like bulldozers going through a rainforest. They don't see the holistic side of anomalies. They don't see the holistic side of the imagination and literature, because science is not an education, and it never will be. They don't have the reading background, and they push bulldozers into the rainforest without that reading background, without a knowledge of the humanities. The scientists are bloody hopeless. They see it as a concrete mechanistic affair, and the whole of the alternative movement in the Western world has been trying to remind them in different ways, different scale, that the objective mechanism, concrete assumptions of the separation of mind and nature are absurd, but most of them don't listen. There are a few scientists who do listen, such as Dr. Jack Safati, with whom I'm writing at the moment. He's a leading quantum physicist and very anomaly sympathetic, but he's a rarity. And this situation I'm describing in the thinking intellectual world and all its manifestations, a lot of these currents of thought can be traced to the non-conformities in the movements of the early 20th century. Charles Fort had a lot of affinity with the Surrealist Manifesto, with André Breton's Surrealist Manifesto. Of course, Charles Fort was an American and didn't meet Breton or members of the French movement at all. But his thinking was rather like the French Surrealistic movement, but he was applied intellectually rather than on canvas. But he had the same spirit of breaking up mechanistic assumptions which were weighing everyone down. The tragedy was 1914, mechanistic assumptions, again, the tragedy of 1914, and the slaughter that was to come. It was ominous of that. That if we go on thinking in the manner of reality is merely mechanical accretion of colonies or money and so on and so forth, He was a hippie in this sense, sympathetic, of course, to human beings, not puritanical or dialectical like the communists, but reminding us to think about a relation to mechanistic accretion. It's going to be aggression. And of course it was, and with 30 million dead. And the surrealists and people like Charles Ford were advocating a much more, if you like, hippie-like, although the word wasn't used then, holistic, spiritual view of things, without, being silly or gnomic in any sense. It was a very strong expression, and it was a warning against the slaughter. And we had similar warnings before. We had them, the movement which stemmed from alternative thinking finally took an army off the battlefield in Vietnam. It took an army off the battlefield for the first time in the history of the world, because the Vietnam conflict was the end of this kind of conflict, in which you had mechanistic accretion again as being the final philosophy, and media helped to do that, and different attitudes to human beings and the manifold characters and personalities, as distinct from merely flamethrower destruction. They're still around, and they can still be traced to this early reaction against the Industrial Revolution, the total success of the Industrial Revolution, at the beginning of the 20th century.